Okay, great. So I wanted to start just with, I thought I'd embarrass Joyce. She posted this last night on Facebook, which I thought was a really nice quote. Education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. And I think, as Steve said, it's not about the technology. I think we've always got to remember it's about enhancing the learner experience that should be at the core of what we do. So here's an outline of what I wanted to talk to you about. I've tried to stick to the conference themes, which I think were digital landscapes meeting future challenges. So I'm going to start with some of the broader concepts of what today's technical landscape looks like, go through some of the kind of ways in which you can map pedagogies to technologies or vice versa. And then I'm going to do some stuff around exploring the notions of identity, presence and interaction. And that fits really nicely, I think, in terms of some of the sessions at the conference. Jane's excellent session yesterday, and also Catherine's doing a nice session on digital identity later. And these are some recent concepts I've been trying to grapple with. I'm then going to share with you our current work on learning design, approaches to help teachers better create new learning experiences. And then I'll finish with three key future challenges, which I think are very current today in the EU in particular. I did a talk in November, or might have been October, in Brussels at the European Parliament. Anyone been there? It's the most amazing building. It's got this huge room, and around it it's all got all these interpreter booths, and it translates every session into 23 languages. And it was for presidents and provosts around the world. So I thought it would be useful for them to give them a timeline of what I thought were some of the key technical milestones. Now, it's always dangerous to do that, and I got into an argument with Stephen Downes on Facebook about it. So some of the kind of markers might be slightly out. But I started with multimedia resources in the late 80s, which is where I actually got into using technology for learning. I started creating interactive materials for my chemistry students. Then, of course, we had the internet. Learning objects emerged, the notion that we could have an economy, an educational economy and sharing of objects. Learning management systems may be boring, but actually they're very important for two reasons. One, they made institutions think about the fact that technologies were core for learning, and institutions started to put in place committees to set up learning management systems, or VLEs. And also they provided a safe nursery environment, a nursery slope if you like, for teachers to explore how they could use technologies for students. Mobile devices, when we look back, it seems comical, the kind of early, kind of huge mobile devices, and there's been quite a few funny photos going around on Facebook about these kind of huge things. And there's one where there are two mobile phones looking at a picture, some of you will have seen it, and it says, yes, our ancestors did have tails, so they're looking at an old-fashioned phone. Learning design emerged in the late 90s, and I'll come back to some recent work we've been doing on that. Gaming technologies around about 2000. Open educational resources, and again, I'll come back to give you a brief history of some of that, the kind of open educational resource movement. Very interesting figure. UNESCO reckon there are over 100 million people who can't afford formal education. That's a really big number. So OERs and these massive open online courses provide a route, a kind of social inclusion route, to enable those people to get educated. Social and participatory media, of course, virtual worlds, e-books and smart devices, and of course massive open online courses. So this is a picture that's been going viral on Facebook. How many of you have seen this? I bet lots of you. Only a few, gosh, I'm surprised. So it's quite an interesting one in terms of mapping some of the tools back to kind of original technologies. So WordPress for blogging, for example, as a kind of reflective diary, Twitter as a set of post-it notes, etc. Facebook as a kind of way of socially connecting. And in a review I did a couple of years ago with a colleague, Jota Alivizu, we looked at the different social media and articulated kind of some of the key characteristics. And these are some of the things that we felt were key that kind of characterise social media. Open practices, the social nature, the fact that they're very complex, they're distributed, participatory, networked and dynamic. If you try to look at kind of where technologies are going, of course there is a new media consortium Horizon report, which talk about technologies in 1, 3 and 5 years' time. But I think a more kind of empirically based study is this one, which is by IPTS in Spain and the Menon organisation. And they did a really detailed analysis through surveys across 4 sectors: the school sector, tertiary sector, the vet sector and adult learning. And they asked people what were the kind of key emergent technologies and what were the characteristics and what were they doing with them. And then they brought a group of us together in Brussels in October to kind of validate that study. And the final report should be up soon. And they categorised technologies into these different areas. And I won't go through those in details, but I think the bottom one's interesting in terms of relating to the notion of designing learning spaces, enhanced learning spaces, blurring the real and the virtual, ensuring that there are enough wall sockets, for example, and that they're in the right place, and enabling kind of people to be able to technologically enhance the physical space. And there's a nice study called the Spaces for Knowledge Generation from Australia, Mike Keppel and colleagues. They did a detailed study tour around the world at innovative learning spaces and came up with 7 really nice characteristics of designing technology-enhanced environments. I recently, through kind of blog interactions, was reminded of a model I did quite a few years ago, which kind of provided a kind of meta-model in which you can kind of tag different learning theories. And this can be used in 2 ways, both to map different pedagogical approaches, but also to kind of articulate where different kinds of uses of technologies for particular purposes sit. And it has 3 levels. Those of you who aren't very good visually might find this a bit challenging, so I apologise in advance. So one dimension of learning is individual through to social. I can sit on my own and read a book, or I can interact with others and learn through that. Learning through information or through experience. And then finally, non-reflective or reflective learning. So often we're subconsciously learning without realising it. Or we might be kind of actively sitting down saying, right, I'm sitting down and learning now. And I'll just map this to 3 examples. The first is Peter Jarvis's work, which is quite old now, on what he calls pre-conscious learning. And that maps to individual, non-reflective and experience-based learning. So, for example, if I'm driving across America in a car, I'm not learning, I'm kind of concentrating on driving, but subconsciously I'm learning about American culture. And Steve will relate to this, having just been in Las Vegas. Or if I'm sitting in a cafe in Spain and just listening kind of indirectly to the conversations around, that's kind of augmenting my Spanish learning. The second example goes right back to good old Dewey, and that's about reflective learning, which is individual, experience-based and reflective. There's a really nice book by Sarah de Freitas and Jill Jameson, which has really recently come out, called The E-Learning Reader. I can really recommend it to you. They've got kind of key chapters of some of the kind of big names in the area, and it includes Dewey's work, Laurillard, etc. And the final example is Laurillard, conversational framework, dialogic learning, which maps to information, reflection and social aspects of learning. But you can also use this, as I say, to look at blog for reflective learning or a wiki for collaborative learning. And spookily, when I developed this framework, Steve Warburton, who's here somewhere, where are you, Steve? Oh, right. So I came across a blog post that Steve had done where he'd done an almost identical model, except for he had, instead of non-reflective and reflective, I think you had informal and formal learning. So it's interesting, nothing's new under the sun. Okay, so just 4 examples of how you can map technologies to pedagogies. Good old-fashioned drill and practice, mobile learning, situative learning, and immersive learning. So drill and practice, kind of considered a bad thing in many ways, but actually it's quite important. If I want to learn my Spanish verbs, I just have to sit down and learn them. I can't do them through constructive dialogue. I have to kind of sit down. E-assessment has been around a long time, of course, but now it's really got quite sophisticated. This is the open mark system at the Open University. You've got a complex chemical equation. Students can link out to some kind of chemical drawing package, go back in, and they can get really quite detailed, sophisticated answers. Another example I came across back in September. This is a site for Spanish learning. I can go through lots of really nice interactive materials. I can get hearts when I do well. If I don't do well, I lose my heart. But also, on the right-hand side, there's a social dimension. There's a kind of notion of following people or being followed. So I'm connected to a friend, Ildiko, in Edinburgh, who's also trying to learn Spanish. And there are lots and lots of these sites now available. Mobile learning can be used for a range of things, to store e-books. How many of you have iPads or mini iPads or smart devices? Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? It's just amazing how many there are. Joyce and I were at the ASCII conference in November, and it looked like it was rigged because we both won iPads. And Joyce really needed another iPad. She's got one in every room. Some examples from Leicester. This is our criminology master's course. They've all been given iPads as part of their package. These are people who are working in very dangerous parts of the world which often don't have access to the internet, so all their materials are preloaded on the iPads. Archaeology are doing something slightly different. They're using smart devices out in the field to collect data. So we really now have the kind of possibility of learning anywhere, anytime with these smart devices. Situative learning, things like virtual worlds, of course, to enable you to do role play and other things. This is a screenshot of a virtual genetics lab that we created at Leicester. This is Paul Rudman's work as part of a project called SWIFT. As many of you will know, that Beyond Distance Research Alliance, which we've now renamed the Institute of Learning Innovation, was headed up by Gilly Salmon. And all the projects were called after animals. So we had PELeCON and Swift and Otter. The animals have all been killed off, I'm sorry to say, and the zoo has been closed. But anyway, some kind of bits, they've been released kindly into the environment, I should say. This is one I came across at that European conference in Brussels. It's a device whereby you can talk into your phone and it translates the voice directly into the language you want to understand and then plays it back to you. And the guy was doing it in real time, really transformative. Immersive learning. I've been trying to learn Spanish. So with Google Immersion, I can be reading a page about Jeff Hayward talking about MOOCs, but actually the immersion tool is translating bits of the text into the language I'm learning. Now, spookily, it seemed to know what language I wanted to learn, which I can't quite work out. But and you can hover over the text and it'll oscillate between English and Spanish. So indirectly, subconsciously, I'm kind of reinforcing my Spanish vocabulary. So some recent work that, again, triggered by interactions on the blogosphere. I've been trying to kind of grapple with the relationship between identity, presence and interaction. And I think the three are very much interrelated. So my identity will inform how I interact. So if I feel confident and open in social media, I'll be much more likely to interact there. And it'll also influence my presence. I had an interesting experience when I arrived on Tuesday night. I saw Catherine, where are you? Catherine and Mary from Ireland. I saw them and I kind of waved at them. And I was absolutely convinced we'd met before. And I kept saying, I've definitely met you. And Mary's going, no, we've never met. I have met you. No. Because we've been interacting on Twitter and through the Photo a Day challenge on Flickr, it just feels as if we already knew each other. And I think a lot of us have those kind of experiences. So there's a complex interaction in social media between these three concepts. So just to unpack those a little bit, identity is very much about how you present yourself online. Jane Davis, where's Jane? Gave an excellent workshop yesterday looking at identity. She got us to look at our own concepts of how we viewed ourselves. And of course, it's how you present yourself online. And we were talking about the fact that some people use Twitter very much as a professional tool. Others mix their use of Facebook with professional and personal. So I kind of love cooking. I drive my kids mad. Every time I cook something, they go, don't take a picture and put it on Facebook. Take a picture. And other people are kind of mad about cats or dogs. And so you learn all sorts of interesting, different things about people. And it's also about how you interact and communicate. So somebody like Martin Weller, for example, is very kind of dry and witty through social media. George Siemens, whenever he goes into Heathrow, kind of goes at M. Weller, at G. Conole, where's the red carpet and roses and things like this. So you get interesting interactions. And it's about reputation, impact, influence, productivity, and the degree of openness. In Jane's session, she got us to draw our digital identity in different roles, building on Lewin's work. Now, remind me, Jane, what's it called? Is it identity spaces?
It's life space.
Life spaces. So you draw a big oval, and I don't know how well you can see this, but so for me, the two biggest roles for me, obviously being a mom, bit sad if I didn't think that was a kind of important part of my identity, and being a kind of academic, my job identity. And then within that, there's connections, friends, colleagues, social networks, cooking. Spanish learning, interestingly, is a separate one. So when you've got kind of blurred boundaries, you've got a kind of degree of overlappingness. The two that are kind of separate are being a sailor, I love sailing, and being a Spanish learner. And then Jane got us to map those in terms of the degree to which we use technologies in these different spaces. So not surprisingly, I don't use technology when I'm sailing. Not a very good idea. Water and technology don't mix. And then the yellow blobs are kind of your influence or identity or presence related to that. So really interesting exercise. Presence. Mark Childs has got a very nice new blog, if you haven't come across it. And he's been talking a lot about presence recently. He's particularly interested in presence in virtual worlds. And he gives this definition about it being about mediated social presence, co-presence and self-presence, which I think is a really nice kind of definition of what presence is about. And finally, interaction, going right back to Moore's work on transactional distance, where he talks about interaction being interaction between learners and teachers, learners and learners, learners and content. And Hillman et al. Then augmented that by talking about interaction between learners and influence. So, in the second half, I'd like to talk about some issues. So, I think I've painted a fairly positive picture so far. It's clear that all these amazing technologies offer amazing ways in which we can communicate and collaborate and interact with materials. And there's an absolute wealth of free resources and tools now available. So the future looks rosy. It looks promising in terms of what these can do for a learning context. However, the reality is these are not being fully exploited. Worse than that, we're seeing lots of examples of replication of bad pedagogy. In a recent survey of the use of Blackboard in our institution, you won't be surprised to hear that the majority of use was simply as a content repository. People were doing very little more than just putting resources up. And if you ask teachers, which we have done, why they don't use technologies more and more innovatively, they say they lack time and they say they lack the skills. How many of you would agree with that? Yeah, so I think it's pretty much universal. Going back to that timeline, we've had amazing technologies from the 80s onwards, and yet still we're not extensively using them. And if you look at it, one of the key reasons why there's this gap between the promise and reality is that teachers lack the necessary digital literacy skills to be able to harness the power of these new technologies. And via a friend, Lisa, on Facebook yesterday, I came across this rather nice diagram, I think, which kind of maps out the different forms of digital literacy skills. So you've got the core 3 original R's, but then you've got learning and innovation skills, critical thinking, communication, collaboration and creativity, life and career skills, information media and technology skills. So there's a very complex mix. And Henry Jenkins in the States and colleagues argue that there are 11 digital literacy skills needed to be part of what he calls today's participatory culture. So the emphasis is very much about participation. And these are a kind of world away from the original 3 R's. Play, distributed cognition, simulation, networking, negotiation, judgment. You may be able to find a resource, but how do you know whether it's kind of effective for what you want to do at that stage? And I would argue there's a 12th, creativity. And any of us know that often the technology is not the problem. Twitter is very simple technically, it's 140 characters. But actually to be able to work Twitter effectively is quite a kind of complex skill. And of course, a lot of us here at the conference, as we can see from the tweet stream, are very comfortable doing that. But it does take a while to kind of find your feet in these new technologies and to get your own aha moments. So as part of a way of addressing that issue about the lack of uptake of technologies and to help teachers make more creative design process, a group of us since about 1999 have been working up a new sub-area of e-learning called learning design and coming up with tools and resources to help teachers make informed learning design processes. And we had a bit of a breakthrough in September. James DL from Australia has had some funding and has brought a group of us together over the last 2 years just to sit down face to face and to work out what do we mean by learning design. How is it different from instructional design? And we were lucky enough to have a meeting in Larnaca in Cyprus in September. And we had a breakthrough and we came up with what we grandiose called the Larnaca Declaration on Learning Design, which kind of articulates what we think we mean by learning design. So it's a nice, concise document which defines the field. I'm currently involved in an EU-funded project called METAS, which is some of the key people across Europe who are working on learning design. And what we're trying to do is put together an all-encompassing learning design environment. And that's led by Yanis Dimitriadis in Valladolid in Spain. At Leicester, we've recently combined the work I was doing at the Open University with the work that they were doing on learning design into a conceptual framework that we've called the 7 C's of learning design. So it starts with conceptualization, what's the vision for the course, then it goes into a cycle of activities. Twitter's going mad, I can see my phone here. Capturing resources, communicating, collaborating, mechanisms to foster good communication and collaboration, and consider, which is the reflection and assessment elements of the learning. Then there are various views to look at the combined design, and finally there's consolidate in terms of putting the design into a real learning context and evaluating its effectiveness. And the resources associated with this are all available on this link. By the way, a version of this presentation is on SlideShare. It's slightly out of date, but it's got most of the relevant links. And you should all have got a paper in your pack which gives you a much more detailed description of the talk and some of the links and references. So I'm going to go through those 7 C's and just share with you 4 of the resources we've developed. And the ones I'm going to share are in red. So conceptualization is the vision for the course. Why are you designing it? Who's it for? What do you want to get out of it? What are the key principles and pedagogies associated with the design? And what's the kind of nature of the learner? Ishai Moore at the OU has done some nice work around this on personas, but I won't go into that today. But I will just share with you the course features resource. So we have a pack of cards, good old-fashioned paper cards, and what you do is you use the cards to kind of decide what are the key things that are in scope for the course. So what kind of pedagogical approaches? Do you want to promote problem-based learning, or is it about reflective learning? What are the key principles associated with the course? What kind of guidance and support is there? Content and activities, reflection and demonstration, and communication and collaboration. So just to unpack those a little bit more. So the principles might be that it's about culture, for example. So I was recently in Australia, and a woman was telling me about an Aboriginal culture course, and clearly culture would be a key aspect about this. Somebody else in a workshop said she wanted to encourage serendipitous learning. Helen Keegan at Salford has done some lovely work on augmented reality games, where she's got the students really kind of in a situation of risk, really outside of their comfort zone. And there's a lovely TED video of her talking about that. So there's a whole set of principles that you can put in place. Then the kind of pedagogical approaches. Is it about fostering collaboration or inquiry-based learning? Is it about vicarious learning? Terry Mays' work, where students learn from each other. So they listen to another student giving an explanation of something. What kind of guidance and support is there? So a first-year undergraduate course might have a very well-structured guided learning pathway. An MSc programme might be much more student-centred and much more loosely structured. There might be additional study skills or support material of some sort. There might be peer support, or there might be kind of quite clear step-by-step instruction. Content activities, there might be kind of things like the jigsaw model, where you put people into teams of 4. Each member goes and researches a part of the problem. They get together with other people from other teams who've been researching the same part of the problem, and then they come back to their home team and combine and kind of form a collective view of the problem. It might be about concept mapping. You might be getting the learners to generate their own content. Reflection and demonstration might be diagnostic, formative or summative. There might be some peer support. It might be that you're really encouraging reflection. OU courses, for example, traditionally have lots of reflective points. It might be a professional course where the students are expected to keep an e-portfolio evidencing their learning. It might be about communication and collaboration. There might be some sort of structured debate. You might have group presentations. You might have a for and against debate, etc. So lots of different ways in which you can encourage the students to communicate and collaborate. The next C is about capture. It's about doing things like a resource audit of existing OERs, seeing which ones you're going to incorporate, or articulating which ones you might need to create. For example, you might want to create podcasts or videos for the course. Mechanisms to foster good communication. Similarly, mechanisms to foster good collaboration. So using things like the computer-supported collaborative learning, collaborative pedagogical patterns, such as the jigsaw one I just mentioned. And then consider starts to kind of put these together, mapping, ensuring your learning outcomes are evidenced by your assessment, for example. And then combining these to give you a more holistic view of the designs you've created. And 3 in particular I wanted to share with you is the course view, which is give us an overview of the course, the activity profile, which enables you to see the different kind of tasks the learners are engaged with, and the storyboard, which puts everything together at the end. So the course view goes through those 4 examples I mentioned before. You list the guidance and support, content and activities, reflection and demonstration elements, and communication and collaboration. And the link just gives you a link to the actual resource and some more details about it. The activity profile enables you to see the kind of tasks the learner is engaged with. Assimilative things are things like reading, viewing or listening. Information handling, like manipulating data in a spreadsheet. Production, creating an essay, a new chemical compound, an architectural model. Experiential, mimicking, practice, work-based. Adaptive, quite specialised, but useful in sciences. Things like modelling and simulation, for example. And then, of course, the assessment elements. And then you can use an online widget to see how much of each of those there are. Which of those columns do you think are often very high? Too early in the morning. Anyone want to... Sorry? Information. No, actually.
First to the last.
Yes. Well done, I'll pay you later. Often we put too much passive stuff in, lots of reading and listening and viewing. And often we over-assess. Certainly the OU definitely over-assesses if anyone's done an OU course. Now that's not necessarily wrong, but just by seeing the profile you can say, well actually I'm going to take out those readings and I'm going to get the students to find some resources and share and discuss them in a forum. You can also show the view to learners themselves. So as a learner of Spanish, when I mapped my profile, my lowest column was communication, and that's my weakest Spanish skill. So I can understand and I can read Spanish quite well, but I'm much less confident at speaking. So there's a direct correlation with what students can achieve with the types of activities they're engaging with. And finally, the storyboard enables you to provide a temporal sequence putting everything together, and it's very much activity focused. So you map the learning outcomes to the assessment, you list the different kinds of activities or activities that the students are engaged with, And then for each you map the kind of things that they're using. They might be reading a document, watching a video, listening to a podcast. They might be asked to create some document as a result of that. Again, they might be kind of reading and listening and whatever and creating, for example, a blog post. Third activity, they might be engaging in a group presentation. So it provides a nice temporal sequence mapping the whole design process. And finally, once you've gone through those stages, you can consolidate it and put it into practice, implement it in a classroom or online, and then you can evaluate its effectiveness, refine it, and if you want to, share with kind of peers through different kind of social networks. So we've used this framework in lots and lots of different workshops, particularly in the last year. And as part of a JISC-funded project called SPEED, we worked with 4 UK institutions in depth over the last year. And the evaluation has been really positive. We've found that these resources help teachers think beyond content to the actual activities the learners are engaged with. So just about finishing now, I wanted to talk about 3 key challenges I think are hitting, which have come out recently through social media and the blogosphere, and through some events I've been at. The first is I want to argue that we're seeing a disaggregation of education. The second is a key issue for Europe, and this is coming from the EU Commission, is that there's a massive gap between digital skills and jobs. And I want to look at the future of work, picking up on a resource I came across on Facebook a couple of days ago. So I think we're seeing a disaggregation of education as a result of more open practices. I think we're starting to see an issue that although resources are freely available, some people will choose to pay for high quality resources. They may pay for learning pathways, support or accreditation. So in terms of resources, we've now had over 10 years of the OER movement, massive set of kind of high quality resources worldwide. Lots of institutions are on iTunes. How many of your institutions are on iTunes? It's interesting, it's still not that many. We finally launched on iTunes with Leicester a couple of weeks ago, and it's very timely because you may have seen that we found the bones of Richard III, so we've got some really nice resources, and it's been trending on iTunes. So Therese Bird, who's been leading on this work, and I are delighted. It's only taken her 3 years to get Leicester on board to get on iTunes, but we're really pleased with the results. Despite these great resources, evaluation shows that these repositories have not been extensively used. So as part of an OPAL project that Steve mentioned, we looked at this in more detail and we analysed over 60 case studies of OER initiatives worldwide and articulated a set of practices around the creation, use, sharing, management of OER. And then we came up with what we called the OPAL Metro Map, which articulates the different kind of things that the 4 stakeholders we identified need to think about. So what kind of vision have they got for open educational practices? What kind of strategies and policies are in place? Right through to things around quality mechanisms, improving the skills of teachers and support mechanisms for teachers. So this is a very practical set of resources to enable you to both create a vision for OER and an implementation plan. As a follow-up, a current project, Power Up, is doing very detailed analysis of OER initiatives and country reports. And it's very exciting. We've just started doing some in-depth case studies around 7 different key OER communities. We're collecting data through surveys and interviews, and we're going to use social network analysis through colleagues in OUNL in the Netherlands to identify the nature of the interactions in these communities and also the key players. A step on from OER, of course, are MOOCs. I recently took place, and Joyce was there, at a debate at Ascalite, the great MOOC debate. We had 2 teams, for and against. I led the for team, and I have to say we were resoundingly thrashed. The against one, hands down. There's a really nice audio of it online. But these are some of the key points for and against MOOCs. Free, enable social inclusion, but very high dropout rates. The opposing team came up with this lovely phrase, it's about learning income, not learning outcome. And many think it's just a marketing exercise. So the debate is still out on MOOCs, I think. The second is learning pathways. Students may choose to have good, pedagogically informed guidance through pathways to map to different kind of pedagogical approaches. They may choose to pay for support, or they might choose to have some kind of payment around accreditation, things like the peer-to-peer university, the OER University Initiative led by Wayne McIntosh in New Zealand, or of course badges. And that will be a nice segue into Doug's talk afterwards, because I know he's going to talk about open badges more in his talk. The second is some work that's been led by the EU at the moment. I went to a meeting last month in Brussels, and that a real key issue they're arguing is that we've got a huge number of ICT skills, ICT jobs, and we haven't got the kind of people with the right digital skills to fill them. So they've set up what they're calling the Digital Skills Coalition, and they're bringing together key educators with key people from industry, people like SAP, and all of the big kind of names, IBM, etc. And this is a kind of roadmap of the kind of things they think we need to do in the next few years to kind of close that gap. And I put a link to the site there. It's well worth a look if you get a chance. And very finally, from a report that I came across a few days ago, I think on Facebook, about the future of work. And these were some of the key points. I didn't read the whole report, it was 60 pages. But they talked about the fact that we're now in a 24/7 culture. I think all of us know that. Any of you going for FP7 EU bids, which I think the closing date is next week? No? Okay, but any of you who have been involved in bidding will know it's always up to the wire. In the last call a few months ago, I was at home cooking, and it was about 8:30 at night, and a guy from Germany was hassling me over Skype, wanting me to give loads of details for a bid that had to be in the next morning. So I was like stirring my sauce and then giving him details and then stirring my sauce again. So it really is 24/7. Working across multiple spaces. You know, I spend half my life working in hotel rooms or airports, it feels. Really, you know, kind of being in the workplace is no longer essentially. And many in this report argues that we are seeing the death of the office. Kind of the issue about, I mean, the terminology is dodgy, but this is the terminology they use, that they've got people coming in who are technically savvy, much more mobile workforce, and it's about innovation, collaboration, and the need for new organisational structures. So, in conclusion, I think learning, teaching and research is fundamentally changing, and I think it's about harnessing the power of these new media and adopting more open practices. Thank you for listening.